name is Kat Bowser. I'm your resident fantasy therapist, and welcome to my channel. Those of you here for the first time, welcome. My name is Kat Bowser. I'm a licensed therapist. I'm also a writer working on my first novel. And on my channel, I like to dig into the psychology behind writing, aka what is the psychology of your characters, your world? Why do people do the things they do? Because in my mind, that is what makes for a more interesting and more well-rounded world, because the way we think and why we choose to do things that we do can be really fascinating. So that's the angle I like to take with everything I talk about on my channel. So today we are continuing my series on types of magic. I do have a collaborator this week. Jamie should have her video up tomorrow. So for right now, I will put a link to her overall channel in the description below. Once she gets her video up, I will update that with a link to the exact video. So today we are talking native magic. So what is native magic? Native magic, I think, is probably what most people think of when they think of magic. These are your creatures who are born with magic. These are your elves. These are your witches and wizards. These are your mythical creatures. So when we talk about creatures that are from like different mythologies and things like that, these are what we're talking about. Creatures that are born with magic. They don't have to speak any spells necessarily to use it. It's just in their bloodline.
So, how bad is this? What can she do with an antique mirror?
It's not just a mirror, lass. It's Titania's mirror. Titania, queen of the third race.
Third race?
You know, gargoyles, humans, and Oberon's children.
I thought everybody knew this.
Yeah, that guy Shakespeare wrote a play about them. A Midsummer Night's Dream?
Scotsmen called them the fair folk. The Vikings called them dark elves. They are changelings, shapeshifters, creatures of pure magic, and their possessions, like the mirror, are vessels of great power.
Wait. Shapeshifters, elves, fairies? You mean the real?
As real as I am.
So I think this one is probably the most diverse of all the types of magic, because each mythology has their own types of mythological creatures, and some of them give you an origin, some of them don't. And we tend to draw from myths when we're coming up with both heroes and magical creatures for stories in the present. I think a lot of times, for example, there was actually a conversation on Twitter about this, about how people use dwarves and elves and things like that. And most of the time they're drawing from what Tolkien did, because he kind of brought it into the modern age. But he drew from all types of mythologies, Norse, Finnish, English, bunch of others that I can't name. So when you're talking native magic, most of the time you're drawing from multiple sources. So you can kind of decide for yourself what type of origin you want to give them, or if you want to give them an origin at all. So with this one, I kind of want to talk about some of the more common features that I see with this type of magic. So first off, like I said, this is magic that is something you're born with. You can't learn this type of magic. You either have it or you don't. For example, the Harry Potter series, you are either born with the gene that gives you the ability to perform magic, or you're not. In some cases, you may be a carrier of that gene, but it may not manifest in you. It may manifest in a descendant, which is how you get presumably Muggle-born. But if you don't have that gene, you can't do magic. That's basically what it boils down to. This is usually the origin for creatures like elves and fairies as well. It's just a magical bloodline is passed in the DNA. Now, the thing I think is interesting about this is that having magic that is past like any other trait, I think that opens you up for you can do some interesting storylines with that. I think Harry Potter touched on it a little bit with the idea of, pure blood, half blood, muggle born, all that stuff. Because that is something that would come up. In most stories, you do have this idea, usually, of these types of characters, usually do mingle with mortals. I mean, so you'll get characters that are born that are a mix between a creature that has native magic and a mortal who does not. And then you have usually an offspring that is an odd mix of the two. One of my favorite examples of this is, of course, from Middle Earth, which is the idea of half-elven, which are basically offspring that are descendant of an elf and a mortal man or mortal woman. And the thing I like about this is that Tolkien had essentially the children of Elrond and his brother Elros. They were half-elven, so they were given the choice. They could pick either the lifeline of an elf or the lifeline of a man. And Elrond chose elf, and his brother chose man. And I think that leads to some interesting stories. So when it comes to, I think, creatures that are naturally magical, one of the things I think is most interesting is how does that affect their everyday life? Because if you think about how we go about our everyday lives, a lot of the times we created technology because we don't have magic, but we want to make life easier. These creatures are born with the ability to do magic, and most of the time, especially with creatures like fae or elves and things like that, it's not a minor bit of magic. I mean, these people kind of use magic throughout their whole day. I mean, it kind of dictates how they do things. So I think that's why a lot of times we like to throw them in with mortals, just so there's that contrast. Because if you're talking about characters that live together in a society where everybody has magic, it's kind of interesting at first, but unless you have a contrast with people that don't, I think it can turn kind of mediocre, which I know sounds weird when you're talking about a story that's full of magic, but I think that kind of is the way it goes about. Because if you think about it, nowadays we have technology like the internet and things like that. When it first came out, everybody was talking about it. Everybody was so blown away by it, but now it's so commonplace. I think the same kind of thing happens with these creatures that have natural magic. Now, the other thing I like is that I think these creatures that have natural magic, you have got to give them a weakness. Because, as I said before, most of the time these creatures have a lot of magic. I mean, these are your shapeshifters. These are the people that can give you curses. These are the people that, can grant wishes, restore your youth, all that kind of stuff. And if you have that kind of magic in a story and there's no limit to it, there's really no conflict. So that's why I think in a lot of these stories, the fairies and fae and things like that are usually the tricksters. They like to mess with man, not so much help them. And so man has to come up with a way to essentially press back against these native creatures. So when you have the trickster type, that's where you can kind of dig into what I kind of talked about in knowledge magic, where you kind of figure out what is it that would make sense for these creatures not to be able to work with. Like, for example, iron and fae is one of the most examples, werewolves and silver and things like that. But you also have mythical creatures who are what I would call the helpers. These are the ones that they actually do want to help mortals. God, I can't think of the name right now. When I was a kid, I used to hear this story all the time. I'm pretty sure it's from Ireland, but I'm really not sure. I think they're called the brownies, which were basically these little dwarf troll-like creatures that would come in, help a household at night, and then they would leave. And they would do helpful things like fix shoes, fix furniture, things like that. And as long as you were respectful to them, they would not cause you trouble. Those are the kind of helpers I'm talking about. And honestly, I don't see these very much in fantasy, because I think people they like the tricksters because it introduces conflict, and I think that's fun. But I think helpers can be just as interesting, because mainly because we don't see them very much, but also I think if you have something that your mortals can give these creatures that are useful, whether it be friendship, whether it be maybe mortals can make wine that these guys haven't figured out, things like that. Having a friendship between an immortal and a mortal, I think, can give you a lot of really interesting storylines. There was when I was a kid, there was a TV show called So Weird on Disney, and it was basically X-Files, but for kids, so it didn't dig into like super dark stuff. But there was this one episode concerning a girl who was essentially I don't think they ever give her species name, but she essentially looks human, but she ages super slow. So she was best friends with the main character's mother when she was a child, and when she comes back into the series, she's still the same age. And she brings up that she has to always move and travel because she can't stay in one place very long because people start to notice she doesn't age. And I think that is a good way to introduce conflict. And they introduced a really emotional component to it as well, because this girl said that she essentially stopped trying to make friends and connect with people, because she says when she first was young, by her standards was young, she made friends like we all make friends. And as she put it, those girls' bones are now dust. So she has outlived everybody that she's come to care about. So as a result, she has blocked herself off. And that is both sad but understandable. And I think that's something you can really do with creatures that have native magic, because their interpretation of the world and the way they live and move through the world is so different than how mortals do it. So that's always real fun to dig into. And then you have this category that I kind of call the in-betweeners. They're neither tricksters, they're not helpers, but they're neutral. So these are ones kind of like they may do something that ends up being helpful to man, like maybe they help with their crops or whatever, but they didn't do it to help man. They did it for their own interests, and man just happened to benefit from it. These are also the ones where usually you can strike a deal with them. Hey, if I do X, Y, and Z, will you do this for me? And if it's enough of a deal, okay. The other thing about creatures with native magic that I have noticed is they are still bound by certain rules. There are still certain rules they have to abide by.
Well, I do want to get back, so I'll give you all the guesses you can make in an hour.
An hour?
Best I can do. What is that?
Oh, it's a program Jack made so he'd never lose at Hangman.
What's it doing?
It's cycling through every one of the 8 billion 7-letter combinations. Those would be my guesses, and by the way, I won't need the whole hour.
This is cheating! You're not guessing out loud. You're using a machine to help you. I don't have to stand here and watch this.
By the rules of Celtic magic, you do. You are obligated to stand here and wait till I'm done with my guesses.
And it, like I said, these are all drawn from different mythologies, basically. So then what the rules are really going to vary. But like, for example, the story of Rumpelstiltskin. This is one I listened to and read a lot when I was a kid, and I'm sure it had some kind of warning and stuff in it originally, but for the purpose of this video, that's not what I'm focused on. what I'm going to focus on is that Rumpelstiltskin is essentially this troll that can weave straw into gold. So he shows up and helps out this girl who is in a situation because her father has made lies that she can weave gold. And so the king tells her, okay, I'm going to put you in a room full of straw. I want it all gold by morning, or I'm going to have you executed. Okay, not a fun situation to be in. So this little troll shows up, and each time he shows up, he says that he will do this deed for her in exchange for something. And so, first she gives him a ring. I think the second time she gives him a necklace. Third time she has nothing, so she promises him her firstborn. And naturally, when he comes to make his claim, she doesn't want to give it up. So he tells her that if she can guess his name, then the contract is void.
No, please, I beg you. You were once so good to me. You took mercy on me then. Please, take mercy on me again. Ask anything else.
Ask her to guess your name.
All right, my pretty. Do you know the secret name by which I go?
Your name?
Yes, my name. That's what I want to hear from you. I'll give you 3 days to discover my name. If you can guess my name within 3 days, you can keep the child. If not, the child will be mine. I'll return tomorrow.
And naturally, eventually, through course of action, she does, and he is pulled into hell, and that's that. But this is a trend I've seen through a lot of myths, which is essentially if a creature that has native magic has made a deal or struck a deal with you and have given their word, they are bound to it. They are bound to fulfill it. And why that is, that's kind of open to your interpretation. I personally like the idea that that's the way their magic works, that words and vows and names and things like that have a particular power to them. So if this creature is giving his vow, it is essentially triggering the magic that is inherent in him, and the magic itself essentially forces him to abide by this rule. So that's my interpretation of it. And that's the nice thing of this, is you can have your own interpretation of it. Is there ever a time where they can break a deal? And this, I think, is where in stories you get the loopholes, because magic, for the most part, with native creatures is kind of like when I talked about magic in books and scrolls and spells, is that a lot of times it's very literal.
Protect these two. Guide their courses.
Archmage, have you forgotten? Oberon's law magically forbids us from directly interfering in human events.
The law that cannot be broken can surely be bent.
This is true.
And again, I think it's up to interpretation why that is. I tend to think it's the nature of the magic itself, because we really don't know where this magical origin comes from, because like I said, each mythology has their own version. Sometimes it's divinely given, sometimes it was a gift, sometimes it comes from a source and their biology allows them to access this source. So you have a lot of different options that you can go with. So that's just, again, my interpretation of it. And I really think that when we are talking about native magic, magical creatures, it's important to establish those limitations and those rules pretty early on, because otherwise I think if you start throwing in, well, there's this exception, there's that exception, it sounds like you're just making it up as you go, which for people that are that write as they go, that's fine. I just find it's more convincing if we know up front, here's all the exceptions or I'm sorry, here's all the rules. And then later on, when you find out there's an exception, it makes sense with the rules you've set up. So that's just me. But I do think, like I said, that these creatures are most interesting when they're contrasted with mortals because of the contrast. Now, that being said, if you're going to do a whole world that's full of magical creatures, that's a lot of fun. Because you have different cultures of magical creatures. So I'm always interested to see, how do they get along? How does their magic contrast or combine with one another? Is there a different source for each of them? So you kind of see what I'm saying. There's so many questions that you can choose to delve into when you do this type of magic. And I think the one that comes up the most, and I'll just touch on this a little bit because I don't want to talk forever, is most of the time creatures that have native magic are immortal. They're either immortal or they live very, very long. And most of the time they also have eternal youth, or they age very slowly. And I think that is usually the appeal with mortals, is they want that. There's always been this drive for immortality, eternal youth, that kind of thing. And I like it, but I want to see more drawbacks to it. And I touched on this in my trope video, Mortal versus Immortal, where I kind of mentioned about an immortal creature is not going to be able to maintain their memory. It's something is going to have to give. And I think the same thing kind of applies here. If you have whole cultures of immortal creatures, what's the downside? What are the cons? I think Tolkien talked about this with the elves a little bit, and I really do like it. The reason that elves only usually have one child is that they're immortal. And so there really isn't this drive to have a lot of children. If you look at the families of elves in his work that had a lot of children, most of them were in the First Age, when elves had just woken up and they were still exploring and they were still learning. I believe, I'm going to say his name wrong, Fëanor. Anyway, he had 7 sons. And as far as I'm aware, that is the most that an elf has had in Tolkien's world. So I think just taking into account those types of things when you make up these cultures can give you a lot of insight into these characters. Like again, for example, Tolkien's elves, they typically married after they reached majority at 50, and they usually had children within the first couple of years, and then their libido just goes away because they become interested in other things. And that makes sense from both Tolkien's philosophy, but also from a storytelling perspective, because you don't want a whole bunch of immortals having more, because you only have so much room. So that's what I'm talking about. It's just when you're doing magic with native creatures, I think there's lots of elements and lots of angles you can take that can be a lot of fun. And so I think it's a lot of fun to explore. So that is my quick video on native magic. I'm glad you guys chimed in. Make sure you check out Jamie's video when she gets it up. And as always, if you guys like this kind of content, let me know with a comment or a subscribe. I will gladly respond. And I hope that you guys will chime in next time. And until then, have a good one.